Namaskar, I'm Gaurav Rastogi. I'm board member and dean at the Hindu Community Institute. This recording is a part of our teaching material, available to the Counselor of Hindu Tradition course. The subject of this talk is speaking at a memorial, presenting death as a hopeful and transformational event. Now, it is an honor and a privilege to be invited to speak at a Sraddhanjali, at a memorial. This is an intimate and important conversation with the friends of the deceased, their family, and loved ones. And in this conversation today, we will talk about the various aspects of a Shraddhanjali presentation. You can use smaller parts of this talk to craft your own speech at a memorial. For those of you who are watching this and that are not a part of the Counselor of Hindu Tradition course, you can find more information about the Hindu Community Institute at hinduci.org. Om Shanti. Our first objective. Our first objective is to recognize the loss of a loved one. This requires preparation. Make sure you have the biographical details of the deceased as well as details of their family and friends, some of whom might be invited to come and talk. You should recognize that death is often a traumatic event for the family, and they're looking for a space to cycle through their own emotional states. They're also dealing with a mystical question and spiritual question surrounding death, about the meaning of death and, in fact, indeed, the meaning of life itself. First, recognition of the loss of a loved one. Our objective here is to create space for the friends and family to pay respects to a life well lived, to make this a celebration of the deceased's life. A space to replay fond memories, and also for the listeners to face their own fears of death and dying, and to give confidence to the survivors. You have to prepare beforehand, before going into a memorial speech, by gathering the biographical narrative of the deceased's life. Make sure to gather information about what made them shine, what made them interesting, what made them most come to life. Whether it's work or people that they loved or the influence they had on their people or their achievements, whatever was dear to them and truly illustrates the breadth and depth of the life that is well lived. Gather those information into a brief narrative. This is to make sure that everyone who's attending, not everyone may be familiar with the deceased. Some people may be friends of the family. And it is important to present the entirety of a life in a summarized narrative. So gather the details and then make sure you're able to confirm those details with the family before you present. Next, prepare beforehand to request selected speakers to come in and speak for a brief period of time, describing their fond memories of their life together. Try to have a range of speakers to come in and speak, and make sure you're giving them a good sense of time so you don't have to stop them. A lot of people like to talk, especially now at the moment of death. They want to share, and you want to make sure that they have enough time, but there's time left for everybody else as well. Try to have a range of speakers so that you get a full perspective of the life that was lived. Inevitably, questions that everyone in the audience has, whether they're facing up to them or not, are in fact of the inevitability and consequences of their own death. This is an important conversation, and we should talk about it. What does it mean to die? What does it mean to live? What happens after death? What happens to our loved ones after our death? These are all questions that must be addressed. And in today's conversation, we'll be addressing some of them. It is important to recognize that the death of a loved one is an important and unfortunate part of every life. And recognizing that and recognizing the importance of grieving in the process of healing. This is important as well. A question everyone carries in their heart, especially those closer to the deceased, are, will we be all right? What happens next? They may not have someone to talk with about this. And it is important to bring those questions up and encourage the audience to talk to the family and offer to speak about these questions. Or you can yourself offer to speak about these questions. These are not things people are trained to talk with others about. They may not know that you're willing to help unless you let them know. A close contact with death can be spiritually a transformative event. This is a time to look at the deceased, to look at a dead body and wonder what separates them from a living person. And then to transfer that question to ourselves. What separates me from this physical mass that I call myself, that I happen to identify as myself, my own body? And this question can lead to a spiritual transformation of the highest order. Because from this question, you can explore the true meaning of life, the true meaning of death, and the consequences of death, and the impact of that on the choices in life that you're making, your philosophy of life, in light of the existence of death itself. Some of the questions that are addressed in the Hindu scriptures are, what are we grieving for? What happens after death? Hinduism has a unique, amongst dharmic traditions, Hinduism has a dharmic perspective, but the dharmic perspective is uniquely different from the Western perspective in terms of our belief in reincarnation, our belief in there is a life after death, but that life after death also happens to be another life. Why do we cremate? Hindus cremate, and increasingly more people in the United States and elsewhere in the world also cremate their dead. Why do Hindus cremate their dead? What is the process of dying, and why it may not be appropriate to say rest in peace with respect to someone who's dead in a Hindu family? So what are we grieving for? What is the truth of being? In the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna addresses these questions with Arjuna extensively, and we'll be using some of those verses to understand the meaning of life itself in this conversation. Now, a few notes on how to read this slide. You're looking at my face and a few verses on the side. You're going to see the Bhagavad Gita verse. For example, this is Shlok 16 in chapter 2 of the Bhagavad Gita. The number is indicated over here. And additionally, the Sanskrit written in Devanagari script and the English translation are available here. If you're interested in learning more, then you can pull up your phone and point your phone camera at the QR code over here. This QR code is your link to a web page which has you have the ability to play the audio of this particular shlok and the Hindi translation, Hindi interpretation or a commentary, and an English translation. The Hindi commentary is by Swami Ram Sukdas in Rishikesh, and the English translation is by Swami Gambhiranand. I picked these because they're simple to understand and do not dilute the import of the verses or the philosophical ideas being discussed. What is the truth of being? This is a series of posts, a series of shlokas in the Bhagavad Gita. Na sato vidyate bhavo, na bhavo vidyate satah, ubhayorapi drushto antas tvanayos tatvadashibhi. Na sato vidyate bhavo, na bhavo vidyate satah. Sat is truth, asat is untrue. So can the untrue ever be true for a part of time? Or can the unreal ever come into being? And conversely, can the real not exist for some time? Does reality have any relationship with time itself? And the answer is, if it's true, if it's real, sat, which is truth, then it cannot be that it is true on Monday, not true on Wednesday, and true again on Friday. It's only provisionally true, and that which has a relationship with time is probably not the ultimate truth. So what's the truth that is unchanging outside of time? What is the truth about ourselves? We are born little babies, helpless and cute, and then we continue to grow into young children, and then grown-ups, adults, and then we begin to age and decay, and eventually there is death. And in this, there is a continuous process of transformation. What about us is true? What about us holds us continually from who we are right now to who we were at birth and who we will be at and after death? What's the chain of continuity in this being? And does that chain of continuity break at the moment of death? Shlok 217. Avinashi tu tadviddhi, yena sarvamidam tatam. What this means is, all this that is pervaded, yena sarvamidam tatam, all this is pervaded, is true. None can bring about the destruction of this immutable. Like the fish in the ocean. The fish come and go, but the reality of the ocean continues. The fish come out of the ocean, they're born into the ocean of the material that's already present in the ocean. And then upon death, they melt back into the ocean. And so to that extent, the body of water, that is the ocean, and all the living beings inside offer a continuity that is immutable, that does not change. The oceanness of the ocean does not change, but the fish come and go. And so it is with this creation itself, where we see things that are filled with change, but there is something underlying everything that is not subject to change. Within our own self, we know that there is something we feel. We seem to acknowledge that there's something about us that does not change, even as we breathe, or as we have food, or as we grow and age and decay. Something about us continues irrespective of all the change. And so, these destructible bodies, our destructible bodies, belong to the everlasting, indestructible and indeterminable embodied one. That's next verse. So we happen to have an insight into our own situation now, where the body that is being cremated, and all of us will die, and our bodies will be subjected to whatever rites and rituals others subject the body to. But those bodies are not ourselves. Our bodies are not merely ourselves. The bodies are destructible. So what we grieve for is not the body, because we already recognize that the bodies are subject to change and are destructible. But the personality, the source of the self inside these bodies, does not change with the body, does not transform as we grow from children to adults and to old age and to death eventually. That non-transforming, non-changing self, could it be said that they have also been extinguished? In the Hindu tradition, the answer is no. It cannot be said that those ourselves extinguish upon death. And what is that self? We are not the body. The true self inside, embodied in us, is birthless, undecaying, ancient, outside of time even. न जायते म्रियते व कदाचिन्नाय भूत्वा भविता वा न भूयः अजो नित्यः शाश्वतोऽयं पुराणो न हन्यते हन्यमाने शरीरे. Ourselves, not the individualized self that identifies with this body and this name, but a certain light that illuminates this being and all the beings all around, indeed this entire creation, that is birthless. It is eternal, outside of time, and therefore not subject to decay and not subject to being destroyed. Therefore, the self cannot be killed. But are you and I ordinarily exposed to this sense of eternity, sense of being outside of time? Surprisingly, we are. We just don't think about it. We do know that it is I who woke up this morning. It is I that went to sleep. And when I woke up in the morning, I was the same person as the one who went to sleep the night before, and so on. We recognize our own continuity over periods of time. So we do have an intuitive sense of continuity. But we confuse ourselves with this changeful body and continue to identify ourselves with this which changes. But the truth is, we recognize this undying, unchanging self within us, except we don't always pay attention to that self. There's a famous philosophical question that was posited by Theseus, who talked about this ship, where this is a wooden ship made of wooden planks, and every now and then one plank would need to be changed because it's become rotten or something. You change one plank, and then you change another plank, and then you change another plank. You keep the old planks aside, and you keep changing planks, and after a while, all the planks on that ship have changed. And the question really is, if you assemble the old leftover planks into another ship, which is materially equivalent of the ship that you began, it is the exact same physical ship that you began the experiment with. And yet now you have two ships. Which of these ships is the actual ship of Theseus? This isn't just philosophical inquiry. This is true for us. This body is subject to change. Boyhood, youth, and decrepitude. We continue to identify ourselves with this body even as it is changing. And so the question for us really is, what about us? It does not change. And knowing this degree of change, the fact that this physical body is subject to change, we are not deluded by it. We understand there is a changeless self behind all this. It's the same with your sports teams. Your sports team might change players. Over years, they might change entire players, and yet you root for the team, knowing and thinking of it as the exact same team as 20, 30, 50 years ago. But why apply it to teams and ships? Why not use this opportunity to think about that yourself? What about me does not change over time? What about me continues? And does that continuity come to a pause at the moment of death? Or does it continue as it did prior to our birth? Just like wearing clothes. In the Bhagavad Gita, this is the famous verse 222, Vasansi Jirnani. This is the very famous verse because it talks about the equivalence of this physical body to clothes. And like the clothes are subject to being crispy and new when they're new, and then tattered and old when they're old, and therefore a need to change clothes. One does not overly identify with one's clothes. When the clothes need to change, we just change. And so it is recognized in the Hindu tradition that similar to how clothes can be changed, the wearer of this body, just like the wearer of clothes, the wearer of this body. In this verse, this is called Dehi, the wearer, the owner of this physical body, the wearer of this body can then drop this body and move to another body. And instead of a changing body that continues to decay, we can switch over to a new body and continue the process of learning. And so, in that sense, in the Hindu tradition, it is recognized that what happens after death is another life. And therefore, the fears of death are much less pronounced in the Hindu tradition. It is not a coin toss where if you have the wrong coin selection, you're subject to infinite hell or infinite heaven. The odds are not, the payoff is not so infinitely high or so infinitely low. Indeed, we understand that ourselves go through a process of reincarnation as a process of learning. So what is this self? This self is indestructible. This is another very famous shlok from the Bhagavad Gita, Nainam Chindanti Shastrani, Nainam Dahati Pavaka. You'll see it talks about the elements. The self is not cut by weapons. The self is not burnt by fire. The self cannot be moistened by water, and air cannot dry it. The self is not a physical material object that can be touched or contacted by material objects. The self is outside of these. It is indestructible and cannot be touched by this material contact. This isn't just philosophical speculation. As you think about, as you're going through the process of grieving, as you're going through the process of understanding the many meaning of death, also take time to consider the meaning of life. What is the sense within me? What is the self within me that is not destructible, that is not touched by the elements? That self is the true self that animates, illuminates this body and energizes me to move around. In the absence of that self, the physical body is the same between a lived person and a corpse. That self is what we celebrate. If it's true on Monday, not true on Tuesday, and true on Wednesday again, then is it really true? And in reverse, if it's only true on Tuesdays and not untrue on every other day, is it really true? This physical expression of this body, this manifested body in this world, was not present before we were born and will not be present after we are long dead. And for this temporary middle, this physical manifestation exists. We've established that the self is outside of time and therefore eternal. But the physical body, why lament the temporary? Why lament the temporary identification with a physical body and name and form and relationships? These are subject to change. These are not the truth. And what is the lamentation? What is the grief? What is the purpose of a grief in association with a physical body or a physical form or a name? The self is a source of much wonder. The self is indeed filled with wonder, but most of us don't. In this shlok, which is in chapter 12, verse 29, some look at this, visualize this self as a source of wonder, and indeed some talk of it as wonder, some hear of it as a wonder. Ascharyavat is the word being used. And someone else indeed does not realize, even after hearing about it. Just hearing about this unchanging, undecaying self is not enough. It is also important to explore and understand directly through direct perception, through a process of meditation, through a process of sitting in dhyana, not Western style meditation, but sitting in dhyana and directly observing and being in immediate, without any medium, immediate contact with ourselves. Can we truly understand the wonder that is the self? This is very important. And therefore, the self does not die. And therefore, because the embodied self does not die, why grieve for the ever-changing body? And this is the instruction that Sri Krishna gives Arjuna. Do not grieve for the changing embodied self, for the body itself. The self within each body does not change. So what happens after death? This is an important question, and one that religious scholars tend to spend a lot of time on. In the Western system, we think of a heaven or a hell, and questions of heaven and hell drive a lot of life decisions because people want to be in the list for heaven. It's almost like some sort of Santa Claus figure. If you're good all life, then you get the gift of heaven, and if you're not, you get the gift or the curse of coals in your stocking or hell. That is not the case in the Hindu tradition. There is Svarga, there is a heaven-like place. There are several layers of those. There are realms that are like that, but those realms are temporary as well. They are also within the bounds of time. So what happens after we die in the Hindu tradition is, if your pool of merit, your punya, is in excess, it's almost like you're carrying a bank balance of punya. You can go to exercise that punya for some time in a higher realm, and then you come back. And so, what it says in this verse 19:20, it's not 19:20, there's no verse, chapter 9, this is chapter 9:20. Dravida mam somapa putapapa. So what this is saying is, people who worship through sacrifices, through ritual sacrifices in the Vedas, for example, the yajnas, they go to the realm of the god, of the king of gods, which is Indralok. And in this, they stay for some time and then come right back down. Te tam bhuktva Svargalokam vishalam kshine punye martyalokam vishanti. This world is mrityalok, because of course it is subject to death. Because of course it is subject to saturation. You can't have too much of anything without beginning to hate it after some time. And because of that, this realm, this material realm, is called mrityalok, the realm of death. And so once you've enjoyed the heavenly world, the Svargaloka of Indralok, then kshine punya, which is once your balance of punyas, the good deeds, it runs low, then you come back up. And then you keep going, gata gatam kama kama labante, which is you keep coming and going, coming and going, coming and going. And so in the Hindu tradition, because of the continuity of life, Life follows life follows life. Even if you go to a higher realm, you can come down, you do come down and then come back into life. Uh, the implications, the philosophical implications of that on real life, on life decisions you make today, are very different. You do things right that are true for your nature. You do things right that are true for your society. You don't do things for sake of an infinite heaven or to avoid an infinite hell. That is not how you make decisions. You make decisions based on what is right within and outside of you. You make decisions in a way that improves the state of the world. Loka sangraha. You make action, you engage in action not for yourself, but for the higher self. Those are all philosophical decisions that you come to as soon as you realize that this isn't an infinite coin toss. There is a process of continuity, coming and going, and this transference of the self from one physical body to another, to another, to another, with some objectives. There is a realm from which there is no return. There is a realm of no return. We call that Paramgati, the supreme goal. Sadgati is the same thing. Sat, of course, means truth, the unchanging truth, and Gati means destination and path. So Paramgati is the path of no return, the supreme goal. So instead of going and coming and going and coming and going and coming, there is a destination from which there is no return, and that destination is blending back into Godhead. That destination is returning and blending back into the source from which all of it, everything emerges, from which everything emanates. So, how do we get there? How do we do that? The path of no return is unmanifested, immutable, and it is the supreme goal. Now, unmanifest is avyakta. Akshara means immutable. So this is the source from which everything came. If you understand the Big Bang, surely it wasn't something coming out of nothing. There must have been something before, something from which time and space emanated. And that too must have as a source, and so on and so forth. A chain of causation that you go back, you still have to go back to some source. And so what is the source from which some part of it is manifested into this world, but much of it is unmanifest? All of it is immutable. And that is our supreme goal. And from this supreme abode, there is no return. So what is the nature of the physical body? What is the nature and relationship that I have with this physical body and I have with this physical universe? What is the nature of all the energies that are flowing through me, animating this being? The understanding that the Bhagavad Gita gives us is that this body, this birth, is the universe acting upon itself through the instrumentality of our being. This verse is often cited as a bhojan mantra. Many people chant this verse at the time of for food, for blessing the food. Brahmarpanam brahmahavir brahmagno brahmanahutam brahmena tena gantavyam brahma karma samadhinam. Everything is Brahman, this creation, everything is Brahman, that which expands. And everything within this is acting upon itself. Even this physical body is part of the same Brahman. This manifest universe in front of us, our eyes, is also Brahman. And our actions in this universe are also the actions of the same universe, Brahman, acting through the instrumentality of our being into the universe. Of the fish and the ocean, all is the ocean, all is the energy of the ocean, and the fish come and go, but the fish are not separate from the ocean. The fish come from the ocean and merge back into the ocean. The fish are merely a means for the ocean to express its own capacity for life. It is the same with us. This is a material universe. Everything is constituted of material objects or materiality and an illuminating light of consciousness that illuminates and activates everything that appears to be conscious and moving, and everything that doesn't. And in the middle, right in the middle, think of it like this. In the middle, the inside world and the outside world, just at the surface of this is a contact which we know as our own selves. We think of ourselves as being in control of ourselves, being the masters of our own physical body and the world around us, but it is not so. Even within us, the layers of consciousness of which we are aware of the physical body and its workings are very narrow. Much of the body's functioning happens below the surface of the conscious. Our digestion, the growing of nails, the flowing of the blood, the pumping of the heart, the movement, all of these motions, some of which we are aware of, as in somewhat in control of, like the moving of the hands or eyes or the mouth, some of which just happens on its own, but all of it is below the surface of the conscious. We are not aware of how we move our fingers. We just know that we can move our fingers by moving our mind. And that gives us a sense of how much of our own body we are in control of. Not much. You cannot, for example, grow a little pinky nail just as I ask you to. It's not possible. And so, the right way to understand our relationship to this universe, this existence, is to understand and recognize that the universe is acting upon itself through the instrumentality, the vehicle of our being. And we misunderstand that as an individuality. We misunderstand that as our ownership or lordship of this physical body and our name and our relationship. But it is not so. We are in fact almost machine-like in how we digest, how we move around, how we respond to anger or fear or other inputs, how we respond to cues is similar to how a machine responds to, for example, your car, to acceleration and braking. Machine-like, we move around in this world, but at our heart, at the center of our heart, sits Ishvara. The Lord resides in the region of the heart. So Hriddeshe Tishtati, which sits in the heart. Ishvara, that which is the Lord of all our senses and Lord of all the universe, the creator or the individual principle that is implied in our each of our individual existence. So the way to know the self is to know your heart through practices of meditation in dhyana, through practices of devotion, and through practices of cognition and wisdom. Through all of these practices, we seek to know ourselves, and through knowing ourselves, we know that which animates through our heart, who sits in our heart and animates us and brings us life, and the rest of the body moves around machine-like. And therefore, why the pride? Why the sense that I am doing everything? Prakrite kriyamanani gune karmani sarvasha ahankar vimudhatma kartaham iti manyate. Ahankar vimudhatma karta aham iti manyate. What that means is the properties of the universe of movement are acting through us in the world outside and the world inside, and deluded by this sense of individuality, we start believing that I am the doer. Aham karta iti manyate, which is to say, I am the doer, I am doing all this, I am the owner of this body and of this money, this relationship, this family, and I'm doing everything. But the truth is that we are not the doers. And in knowing this, in understanding this, in relaxing into the source of the self, we will find peace. In the Hindu tradition, we understand that at the moment of death, after the death, the self, the Atman, the Jiva, leaves the body, but is yet connected to the body, feels a sense of connection to the physical body because of force of habit, and continues to try to come back to a familiar pattern of life. But we understand that its destination is now elsewhere. That being now needs to move to another life and give birth to another life and another story to go into. We cremate bodies and we say, Om Shanti Sadgati Praptirastu. Sadgati is may they attain the supreme goal. Om Shanti, may they attain peace. Why peace? We cremate the bodies in order that they understand that this chapter is over and they may please move on in peace to the next chapter. Let us not hanker to come back into this life that is now over, but instead move on to the life that awaits us. And so we cremate our dead. And that is also why Hindus don't say rest in peace. In some traditions, you don't get off at a train station to take the train to another station. You simply get off at the train station and wait. Which is to say, in many traditions around the world, there is the concept of a judgment day. Those traditions don't recognize reincarnation. And in those traditions, at the moment of death, the body and the soul are separated. And then the body is laid to rest under the ground, and the soul sits somewhere else and waiting. And on Judgment Day, those two might be reunited and then presented for judgment of eternal heaven or hell. And there, in that context, saying rest in peace is highly appropriate, because what are you going to do between now and Judgment Day? There's no point being restless. You can rest in peace. But in the Hindu tradition, that is not what we say. We instead say, Om Shanti, may you find peace. Sadgati Praptirastu, may you travel to the supreme goal. We do not want our loved ones to be sitting forever at the train station for a train that may or may not ever come. We wish them an onward journey. We wish them to now continue their journey of progress from one body to the next. There is no waiting for long periods of time in the Hindu tradition. And so it is inappropriate to say rest in peace. It is fashionable because we don't think about it and we don't know the meaning of rest in peace. But in the Hindu tradition, and in fact all dharmic traditions that believe in reincarnation, resting is possibly the last thing you want. You want them to find peace and to go on to their onward journey. Why? Because at the moment of death, imagine standing at the train station and determining you've got off from one train and you're trying to look for your next train, and you're in a state of confusion, you're in a state of uh, bereavement, you're in a state of loss, and you are in the state, you're not able to make good decisions about which train to take next. It's the same here. Antakale cha mameva smaran muktva kalevaram yah prayati samadbhavam yati nasyatra sanshaya. Which is to say, at the time of death, anyone who departs by giving up the body while thinking of God alone attains the state of God, Sadgati. There is no doubt about it. The thoughts at the time of death, the clarity of purpose and the clarity of intention determine your destination after death. And so it is best to think of God at the moment of death. There is a story, many stories associated with this. A story that is often told is that of Bharat Rishi, very famous, very accomplished Rishi who, when he retired into the forests, took on a little fawn, a little baby deer as a pet, and he would feed him every day. And so when it came for Bharat Rishi to die, time for him to die, he was worried about his little deer because the deer had gone off to graze somewhere in the forest. And because of this, because he was thinking about the deer at the moment of death, he came back to be born as a deer. And then he had to live out a life as a deer. He remembered, because he was an accomplished rishi, he carried memories into this and the subsequent life. So the next life he came back as a young man. But because he was aware of the challenges with what happens at moment of death, he decided he didn't want to get into trouble from the beginning. So he decided to remain silent. And he was silent all the way until a very important story which we won't get into. And in this birth he was known as Jad Bharat. So the message here is, at the time of death, we want the deceased to be in a calm and peaceful state of mind so they may pick their onward journey appropriately. Because otherwise, as your thoughts, so is your destination. Thinking of any entity, whichever it may be, one gives up the body at the end, he attains that one, having always been engrossed in its thought. In the Hindu tradition, we understand that at the moment of death, your thoughts at the moment of death become the seeds for your next birth, becomes the inspiration for your next birth. And so we want that inspiration to be of the highest quality. We want the deceased to find peace and find inspiration and find Sadgati, a merging back into the Supreme Soul. And therefore, at the moments of death, it is important to follow the rituals that we have in our tradition. And also that is why we don't say rest in peace. But what about us that are not yet, have not yet reached the moment of death, which may come at any time? How do we live? Therefore, think of me at all times, think of God at all times, and act. There is no doubt that by dedicating your mind and intellect to God, you will attain God alone. Me, in this case, Sri Krishna, Bhagavan Sri Krishna refers to as himself, which we understand to mean God, himself who is God incarnate. And therefore, all our moments of life, we think about and dedicate our actions to the Supreme. Because you don't know the moment of your death, but through this lifelong practice of thinking of God alone in all your actions, you may finally, even at the last moments, find the same destination. And then thoughts of prayer and devotion. There are 4 types of people who pray to God. Those who are afflicted, Artha; Jignasu, those that seek knowledge; Artharthi, the seekers of wealth; and Jnani, the man of knowledge. All 4 people, Chaturvidha Bhajante Mam, which is all 4 of these types of people, pray to divinity, pray to God. And what's being asked of us here is, as we engage in action, as we engage in devotion and prayer, we find God at the center of our heart as we understand our own individuality to be as well. That our self is illuminated by the super soul, the self behind all ourselves. And understanding that, we may relax into that underlying self, which is the creator of all there is. It is important to grieve with the death of a loved one in the family or a friend. It is very important to grieve, and grieving is an essential and natural part of the process of healing from the shock of death. So it is important for you who are coming in to listen to this talk, and those who are dealing with the loss of a loved one, to properly give grieving its time. Let the natural course of grieving take place. Give it the time. Don't just rush back into work. Use this time to rekindle the fondness of the memories together without hankering, without always asking for a return to those days, but just letting the warmth of that association continue in your present moment. Also use this time to reconnect with the extended family who may also be grieving and may be looking for support in this moment. Use this time to rebuild your association, rebuild yourself, and give yourself and your family and your friends and your extended community the opportunity to grieve fully and to recover fully from this loss. Practices to help with grieving. Kirtan or singing together is a very important and a very conventionally followed method in the Hindu tradition. In most family or many families, your loved ones will come together daily, once a week, once a month, a certain periodicity, to go through this devotional singing and chanting together. Why? It allows everyone to come together. It also allows us to unburden our heavy heart. Our heart is heavy with loss. Our heart is cold and it's not flowing into our work or any other thing that we do. This heaviness must be stopped. And I'm reminded here of this poem by Maya Angelou, which is: a free bird leaps on the back of the wind and floats downstream till the current ends, and dips his wings in the orange sun rays and dares to claim the sky. The free bird is free to move, and yet, but the bird that stalks down his narrow cage, a caged bird, can seldom see through his bars of rage. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. For the caged bird, singing is its only way of escape, of dreaming, of articulating its desire to be free. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. Our heart sings of freedom, wants to be lightened of the burden of this heavy loss that it is suffering from. The free bird thinks of another breeze, it is free after all, and the trade winds soft through the sighing trees, and the fat worms waiting on a dawn bright lawn, and he names the sky his own. But a caged bird that stands on the grave of dreams, his shadows shouts on a nightmare scream. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. Our heart wants to sing, it's heavy with this loss. Engaging and singing together devotional chants, singing praises of God together allows us to reconnect with our heart, reconnect with our loved ones, and allows us to lighten our heavy heart. And so it is important to go through the process of grieving, of singing and chanting Kirtan together, and allowing your community to heal from this loss that you've just experienced. In the Hindu tradition, death is a hopeful and transformational event. Not filled with fear, but just like shedding clothes and buying new ones. Shedding a body is a way to move to the next body, or eventually merging back into the source of the self. That is nothing to be afraid of. That, in fact, is something to look forward to. And in that sense, death is a hopeful event. It is also a transformational event, because only when coming directly into proximity, face to face with the eventuality of death, do we ask the questions that must be asked. What does it mean to be alive? Understanding that death, like birth, is an essential part of life. Death, like birth, does not signal the coming and going of something temporarily, but only represents, like the wearing of clothes, a form that we take on for play, and then we move on, shedding this form and moving to another form, and so on. How does that reflect on our lives? What does it mean to live then? What does it mean to be alive in this body? What is the purpose of all the wealth and all the name and all the experiences that we're collecting in this body, in this form, in the memories? What does it mean to live? How do I reorient my own philosophy of life? How does this brush or proximity with death allow me to think about the true meaning of our own lives? How does this realization of a clearer meaning of life translate into an actual philosophy of life? How does this philosophy of life translate into the action of life, into the everyday decisions that we're taking? How does the contact with death make us a better human being, allow us to live more completely, more freely, more vividly, but also more selflessly, more in tune with the nature of our own inner selves and of the world and the requirements of the world outside? How does this contact with death reorient our own philosophy of life and the everyday actions and decisions that we make? Contact with death is an opportunity for reflection. As you go through the process of grieving, it is important to also use this opportunity to reflect on your life as it has been and as you would like it to be. And with that, we're going to go to a verse that I'd like to chant with you, and we will then sit in meditation for a few moments. for peace and release, we're going to chant the Mahamrityunjay mantra. This is a mantra in the Rig Veda. It's one of the oldest scriptures available in the Hindu tradition, so it's a really, really old mantra. And the metaphor being used here, it's a mantra for peace and release, for freedom, moksha. And the metaphor being used here is that of a cucumber, a ripe cucumber that dangles from its branch, and then when it's fully ripe, it just falls off and just finds release naturally. No force is needed for the ripe cucumber to separate from its branch. It just lets go and drops down from the tree. And so it is with all our anchoring, our need for possession, our clinging. May we attain release from all that clinging, whether it is to things in the world or this embodied self itself. Please sit comfortably. We're going to sit with our eyes closed. Sit with your eyes closed. Back, neck and head in a straight line. Relax the expression on the face. Relax your shoulders. Relax your belly. Bring your palms together in Namaskar Mudra at the heart center. Pressing the palms together gently. Pressing the fingers together gently. Gently touching the back of the thumbs into the chest. And stay right here and listen. And let the sounds penetrate deep into the self. And then we sit in silence. Om Hom Jum Sa Om Bhur Bhuvasvaha Om Trayambakam Yajamahe Sugandhim Pushtivardhanam Urvarukamiva Bandhanan Mrityor Mukshayamamritat Swaha Bhuva Bhu Om Sa Jum Om Om. I'll chant 10 more times. Om Hom Jum Saha Om Bhur Bhuvasvaha Om Trayambakam Yajamahe Sugandhim Pushtivardhanam Urvarukamiva Bandhanan Mrityohor Mukshayamamritat Swaha Bhuva Bhu Om Saha Jum Om Om. Om Hom Jum Sa Om Bhur Bhuvasvaha Om Trayambakam Yajamahe Sugandhim Pushtivardhanam Urvarukamiva Bandhanan Mrityor Mukshayamamritat Swaha Bhuva Bhu Om Sa Jum Om Om. Om Hom Jum Sa Om Bhur Bhuvasvaha Om Trayambakam Yajamahe Sugandhim Pushtivardhanam Urvarukamiva Bandhanan Mrityor Mukshayamamritat Swaha Bhuva Bhu Om Sa Jum Om Om. Om Hom Jum Sa Om Bhur Bhuvasvaha Om Trayambakam Yajamahe Sugandhim Pushtivardhanam Urvarukamiva Bandhanan Mrityor Mukshayamamritat Swaha Bhuva Bhu Om Sa Jum Om Om. Om Hom Jum Sa Om Bhur Bhuvasvaha Om Trayambakam Yajamahe Sugandhim Pushtivardhanam Urvarukamiva Bandhanan Mrityor Mukshayamamritat Swaha Bhuva Bhu Om Sa Jum Om Om. Om Hom Jum Sa Om Bhur Bhuvasvaha Om Trayambakam Yajamahe Sugandhim Pushtivardhanam Urvarukamiv bandhanan mrityoर्मुक्षयमामृतात् Swa Bhuva Bhu Om Sa Jum Om 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 Hum Jum Sa Om Bhur Bhuva Swaha Om Trayambakam Yajamahe Sugandhim Pushtivardhanam Urvarukamiva Bandhanan Mrityoर्मुक्षयमामृतात् Swaha Bhuva Bhu Om Sa Jum Om 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 Bhu Om Jum Sa Om Bhur Bhuva Swaha Om Trayambakam Yajamahe Sugandhim Pushtivardhanam Urvarukamiva Bandhanan Mrityoर्मुक्षयमामृतात् Swaha Bhuva Bhu Om Sa Jum Om 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 Hum Jum Sa Om Bhur Bhuva Swaha Om Trayambakam Yajamahe Sugandhim Pushtivardhanam Urvarukamiva Bandhanan Mrityoर्मुक्षयमामृतात् Swaha Bhuva Bhu Om Sa Jum Om 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 Hum Jum Sa Om Bhur Bhuva Swaha Om Trayambakam Yajamahe Sugandhim Pushtivardhanam Urvarukamiva Bandhanan Mrityoर्मुक्षयमामृतात् Swaha Bhuva Bhu Om Sa Jum Om Om. Sitting quietly, absorbing the vibrations. We're going to end this talk. Continue to sit comfortably. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.